The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. We sometimes talk about slavery and indentured servitude on the program, but recently it's been usually pegged to stories related to the 2022 World Cup, which is going to be held in Qatar. And I've talked about how a lot of those facilities are being built by effectively slave labor from other countries typically, although presumably with some Qataris as well. And there's a new report out that more broadly assesses the degree to which slavery still exists on the planet, and it's bad. It's bad because, as far as the report can say with certitude, more than 40 million people were trapped last year as slaves in some combination of forced labor and forced marriages. And interestingly, forced marriages, there are some who believe forced marriages shouldn't really be considered slavery, that those are really something else. But really, by the definition of slavery, forced marriages and forced labor are not actually drastically that different. And of course, when you consider that forced marriages are part of slavery, then you very quickly understand why it would be that an overwhelming number of slaves, I think about 75%, are female, women and girls, according to this latest report. And this probably understates the degree to which slavery is a problem, because many people, knowing that slavery in most of the world is not seen as okay, are going to not be forthcoming about slavery that they may be aware of. So it's one of these things where by its very nature, you're going to have underreporting, and thus it makes it more difficult to really get an accurate count of how many slaves there are. But this is a major, major problem. And it's very easy, Pat, when you live in the U.S. So yeah, anecdotally, I know about some instances of what might be called slavery, but this is not really a problem. 40 million people at a bare minimum are in what we would consider slave conditions.
Right, because when you add in more and more forced and arranged marriages, obviously that number would go up internationally. And the other thing that's concerning, too, is that these people aren't often very public.
Right.
So maybe they're working at like a construction site, or they're working on a farm or in a factory. I mean, you're just not going to see those people day to day. There are exceptions, I guess, like many of the women that are in slavery now are, in sex trafficking.
Yes.
So, but I don't imagine most people that are signing up to, be a John in that scenario are trying to get them free, right?
No. If you show up and you're looking to solicit prostitution and you have an inkling that the provider of sex services might not be there completely of her own will, typically it would be a woman, you're not necessarily going to go alert the cops, right? Because for the most part, you're also participating in something that's against the law. And as far as the division, about 25 million people that are considered slaves are working in factories, and that the factory thing is a big deal. And very often the way that this works is there's sort of a promise of employment that's made in the native country of the individual. A company will say, we'll help you get to wherever it is that our factory is, and you can work there. We'll give you free housing. We will feed you, etc. You get there, they take your passport. You basically don't leave the factory because you are working there and you are living there and you are being fed there. You don't have a passport, so you can't get home. You can't really communicate with anybody. And it's also unclear exactly what your legal status is in the country. So even if you were able to sort of contact law enforcement authorities, it's not totally clear what would even happen, and that's kind of by design, and very often there's also a language barrier. So these are really horrible situations.
And it's estimated that about half of the people there are there to repay debts.
Right.
So I'd imagine they take people in a very vulnerable position. Maybe they haven't eaten in a while, or they don't have any shelter, and they offer that to those people as sort of an olive branch, and then they get involved in this whole trade, and at that point, they're at their mercy,
And what's even worse,
and they're able to determine what the cost is of that service that they provided them. Maybe it was just, a little bit of food that could translate to a whole year working as their indentured servant.
Right. So you might have people who are already they're in debt in their home country, and that's why they accept these jobs in the first place. But then as soon as they arrive, they're told, well, you do have to pay off $1,500 worth of hiring fees that we experience before we're even going to actually pay you anything. For the next 6 months, you might be working just to pay off what you arbitrarily and capriciously owe to the employer for having brought you to where it is that you are now enslaved. It's pretty sick, because you're almost, in a way, you've got to pay off the process which enslaved you.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's absolutely vile. So we will follow up with more information as more detailed data from this study is released, but absolutely horrible stuff. I interviewed a guy I think at this point it was probably about a year and a half ago. Like, does this interview ring a bell? A guy who talked about the planetary kill shot and Planet X. Does
Not
that ring
that
at all?
one, no.
Okay. Anyway, I interviewed this guy who had this hypothesis about Planet X and something about Catholicism. I mean, it was a completely harebrained conspiracy theory of some kind. But now this is actually becoming more prominent in the news because there are some who believe that this weekend, or was the 23rd is Saturday,
Yes.
right? Yes, Saturday's the 23rd.
The last Saturday we're going to have.
It might be the last Saturday we have, according to some people who believe that September 23rd, 2017 is going to lead to a sort of a cataclysm of the universe where Planet X, in combination with the sun being close to the constellation Virgo or under the feet of it, connected to the sixth seal of Revelation, and does it even really matter, right? I mean, you know what I'm talking about. It's another one of these end of the universe, end of the world conspiracy theories, and it involves Planet X, which supposedly, I guess, is a planet. See, the thing is, this is where they get you, because there are hypotheses about a planet, which some have called Planet X, that is connected to our solar system, but is out beyond Pluto.
Even though Pluto is not even a planet anymore, but I guess it would be big enough to be still considered a planet.
In any case, Planet X is beyond Pluto, whether or not Pluto is a planet. And so they create these conspiracy theories based around something that has a grain. Like if you Google Planet X, you will find actual scientific discussions of the possible existence of such a planet. Of course, none of those relate to the end of the world on September 23rd. None of it relates to astrology and the constellation Virgo, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, every time we've interviewed these end of the worlders, once we get to the date that they've established as the end of the world, and of course the world doesn't end, we can never get them back on the program. Like there was a really famous one, a woman who was a follower of this guy named Harold Camping. This was years ago. And I think it was like May 21st of, I don't even know what year, 2012 or 2013.
That rings a bell, yeah. I do
something
remember
like that. And she was sure that that day, that was the end of the world. And I said, well, will you come back and talk to us if it's not the end of the world? And she said, well, listen, I think if it's not the end of the world, she was honest, I think if it's not the end of the world, I'm going to be really upset because it means I wasn't selected to go to heaven or something like that. So I don't know that I'm going to be up for doing interviews. Of course, the date came and went. And we tried to reach out to the woman a number of times and never heard back because I wanted to hear what happened. What went wrong in the calculation and why did the world not end?
Yeah, that was what I was wondering. If you're wrong in your prediction and the world doesn't end, does that make you upset? Did you want to die all along? Or are you just not happy with the position that you are in your life?
Well,
or do you want to see yourself redeemed and your beliefs validated, right?
That's
and
the
end
thing.
up one of the chosen people to enter heaven.
If you believe that the rapture, if you believe the end of the world is going to be religiously based and it's going to be a sort of rapture which will separate good and evil and the good people are going to ascend to heaven and the bad people are going to burn in hell for all of eternity or some similar hypothesis, if it doesn't happen, you're probably upset because you were expecting that you would be one of the people who ascends to heaven.
Yeah, and then no one will ever believe you again if you'd make another one of these claims. But maybe there's something to this one, David, because it says in Scripture that there's going to be a sign in the sky shortly before the end of the world.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of people are pointing to the Great American Solar Eclipse and also all of these hurricanes and the earthquakes that have been going on. So I think it's an open and shut case.
It's just so silly when they say there's going to be a sign in the sky before it happens. Well, it's been weeks already since the eclipse. Like, why would it be that the way it happens is 3.5 weeks after the eclipse is the end of the world? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
ever.
you're just thinking within that U.S. paradigm, too. I
That's
mean,
the other
there's
thing.
eclipses that happen all across the world, you know?
Not to mention,
every year or so?
if this is the end of the world, why would it be signaled by an eclipse only visible in the United States? I mean, right? I mean, that also doesn't really make any sense. None of it makes sense. But anyway, if it's not the end of the world on Saturday, we can follow up on Monday about what the people who believe this are thinking.
So obviously scientists don't agree with this, but if we actually were on a crash course with some asteroid or something that was going to kill us all, do you think they would tell us?
I think we would know. Yeah, I mean, that goes back to that question we got from the audience. When would it be okay for the government to lie to the people in order to try to prevent panic or out of control rioting or craziness or whatever it might be? At this point, there are so many independent astronomy groups and astronomers that are tracking potential impacts with the planet, and they're tracking them a very, very long time ahead of when they would even happen, that I think it would be very hard to keep that quiet. I just don't know
Yeah.
how it would be kept quiet.
And that's actually one of the reasons why these end of the world predictions are so dangerous, because people freak out, they overprepare, and sometimes you even have instances of people killing their own family members, like infants, for example.
Cult-like stuff.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's absolutely insane. And I know that we don't, it's not an attempt to stigmatize mental illness, but we do have to explore whether there is a mental illness component here if you become susceptible to this type of thing. I don't think that there's anything offensive about considering that, because really, if you have any connection to the real world in a sort of what we would call healthy way, it's very hard to imagine really falling for something like this and starting to live your life as if the world is ending on September 23rd, as the case may be. Okay, frequent flyers. There's been a lot of research done into the effects of flying very, very frequently, and one of the areas of research has been radiation, right? If you are up closer to the edge of our atmosphere, which you are closer if you're flying at 30 or 35,000 feet in an airplane than being at sea level, you are exposed to more radiation, and what is the health impact of that? But there's now research into other ways in which flying can affect you. Now, as people who have been with the program for a while know, I seem to be particularly affected by thinner air, and both on airplanes where you have cabins pressurized to, I believe it's roughly, depending on the airplane, around 7,000 to 8,000 feet, although I believe the new Boeing 787 is pressurized to more like 5,500 or so feet, a more comfortable cabin, both on airplanes and actually in elevated areas on the surface of the Earth. I've had tendencies towards low blood pressure, for example, and that's one thing that can happen when you are on an airplane. But there's now studies about other ways in which being on an airplane can impact people, including emotionally. And there's been a survey done which suggests that when people watch movies on airplanes, they are more likely to cry from feeling emotional than watching the same movies not on an airplane, presumably close to at sea level. And some airlines are actually now offering emotional health warnings before in-flight entertainment starts, indicating that the content might upset customers. Other ways are taste buds can be affected being on an airplane, food tasting different being on planes. What else was mentioned in the study? There's a lot of science around jet lag and what that does. But this is, it does make sense that being in an enclosed metal tube with an artificial atmosphere might impact both physical and emotional elements of human well-being. And this is why it makes a lot of sense if we think about a 6 or 9 month trip to Mars in completely artificial atmospheres. We really need to be doing a lot of due diligence about how both the physiology of humans and the emotional, psychological component is going to be impacted.
And it's not just the pressure, too. It's also that there's less oxygen in your blood. So
Yeah.
I guess 6 to 25% less. I mean, you're going to experience some signs of hypoxia if you're up in that tube, especially if you consider, maybe you're flying across the world or something on one of those long flights.
Yeah, although I
the
think
problem's
that
not going to get better.
it is still pressurized, and you have an oxygen thinness that humans can adjust to. In other words, many people live at 8,000 feet, which is what airplanes are pressurized to. But on paper, when you go to a higher elevation, you're not supposed to do strenuous physical activity for at least 24 hours until you've been there. You're not supposed to drink alcohol until you've been there for 24 hours. There aren't any 24-hour flights, right? So anybody who is either very physically active, which would be hard to do on a plane, right? I mean, what can you do other than sort of walk up and down the aisle?
Back and forth.
But drinking alcohol, quite common on airplanes. Anybody who's drinking alcohol on airplanes, in a technical sense, is going against what are the medical community's recommendations when you are adjusting to a higher elevation, which is no alcohol for 24 hours. There aren't 24-hour flights, so any alcohol being consumed on planes is going against doctors' orders, strictly speaking, right?
Yeah, and I think there's something going on psychologically, too, where you just feel vulnerable because you have no control as to where that plane is going.
Oh,
I
that's
mean,
interesting.
You're just sitting down and you're trying to enjoy the ride if you can, but let's say you have a fear of flight. I mean, you're going back and forth between being incredibly bored and being incredibly terrifying. And a lot of people have just a feeling of hopelessness if they're up at that altitude for a long period of time.
So there's like the way in which the physical changes from being on an airplane could impact one's emotion. But there's also, of course, just what you might be feeling because you're on a plane if you're afraid of flying or whatever the case may be. So yes, if you feel weird on a plane, it might be more than just you don't like turbulence or something like that, I guess is what the study is telling us. What I can assure you is I will not be having any alcohol on planes anytime soon.
And don't watch the Bee Movie or The Simpsons, because I guess those are some of the TV shows and movies they tested, and those aren't really waterworks films, you think, but people started bawling their eyes out.
It's hard to imagine crying when you watch The Simpsons movie, although I haven't seen it for a long time and I don't remember. Maybe there are sad moments in it, but yes, very, very interesting study. And I know we have a lot of pilots in the audience. Maybe some of them will weigh in. How would this reality impact pilots who are flying the plane in a stressful situation? I don't know. All right, that's it for the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.